Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Hi, I'm Colton, LeClaire. Thank you for joining us for Ethical Perspectives on the News. The land we call home and refer to as Iowa is also home to some of the most fertile soils in all the world. Iowa is ranked second in terms of food production within the United States, and you may have heard phrases that go something like, Iowa feeds the world. But what about nurturing the people of our local communities? Many may be surprised to learn that the people they interact with on a daily basis could be facing challenges that stem from hunger or food insecurity. How is it that a state leading in food production could have members of its communities facing food insecurities? Who is being affected, and what are some solutions we can deploy so that all the members of our community can be well? I'm joined by some wonderful people this evening. I'd like for them to introduce themselves and tell us what food insecurity is and why it's important to them. Anyone can start there.
Okay.
Go ahead, Emily.
All right, great. My name is Emily Renshaw. I'm the Executive Director of Feed Iowa First. And for us, food insecurity is the inability to provide nutritious food or enough food for your family and your home.
I'm Chris Ackman. I'm the Communications Manager at HACAP, which stands for Hawkeye Area Community Action Program. And our mission is to build stronger communities. And so we do that in a few different ways. One of the most popular ways that we do that is through our food reservoir. We're a Feeding America food bank, and we serve 9 counties in eastern Iowa.
Great. Well, what does food insecurity look like in Cedar Rapids and or Iowa at large? If either of you have experience with Iowa at large, feel free to speak to that. But of course, we're concerned about food insecurity in Cedar Rapids and what that really looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. So with Feed Iowa First, we are the main local grower for Linn County food pantries and families in need. And so everything that we distribute is primarily produce and in vegetables and fruit. And one thing that we see, whether it is working in apartment complexes or through pantries, is we see a lot of families who are stuck in the middle, who may not qualify for federal food assistance like SNAP or free and reduced lunch or WIC, but they're not able to go to the store to provide food for their families, especially food that is nutrient dense or is more nutritious. And so as we go out on our rounds, we serve a lot of people, maybe the community doesn't necessarily think as food insecure. And these may be elderly populations on fixed incomes, individuals who are having health issues, who maybe were working full time and are no longer young families with kids, or just a lot of people in life's transitions.
Yeah, Emily mentioned something that was really great. Families that are stuck in the middle, and that's a really big challenge for families here in eastern Iowa. And so that's one thing that we really try to work on, to provide services and food to families, try to meet them where they're at. A lot of times you'll see income guidelines, and we see a lot of families who are maybe just right above those income guidelines, who maybe don't qualify for a service. The other thing to keep in mind too is especially during this time, inflation is high. During COVID, a lot of people were laid off, maybe switching from job to job, having illness. For families who are on a fixed income, who have a tight budget to already work with, it just takes one thing, inflation or a car repair or something, to really just throw them off. And so that's the unfortunate thing that we see in eastern Iowa. The unique thing, I think, for us, when you look at food insecurity, especially in the territory that we serve, is food insecurity even looks different from when you go from Cedar Rapids to a rural area in Iowa. So just based on geography, you have a lot of options in Cedar Rapids maybe to get food, but say you move out to a rural part in Iowa, there may not be as many options like a grocery store that is within traveling distance for somebody who is maybe elderly, who can't get around enough as it is, and it's a challenge for them. So that's one thing that we try to meet people where they're at too, especially in those rural areas, and especially as we're coming up on winter time too. It kind of makes it even more of a challenge for people to get out and about.
Now, Emily mentioned food insecurity and the nutrient deficiency. I'd like to talk about the distinction between nutrient deficiency and calorie deficiency, because it seems like there are kind of two different things going on here, and they may go hand in hand in some situations. But can you talk a little bit about maybe what we face more and what those two things are, calorie deficiency versus nutrient deficiency?
Yeah, absolutely. So here in the United States, calorie deficiency is not a significant problem. The majority of our population is able to find enough calories to sustain life. Now, that doesn't mean that kids are not going to bed hungry, but for the most part, our food system is able to supply that, right? Nutritional insecurity is a new and upcoming term, and that's something at Feed Iowa First we are really interested in, to ensure that the food that our most vulnerable populations have access to, whether that's through food banks and food pantries, or through government programs, is not only sustaining life, but also increasing health equity. We believe that the foundation of health equity really begins with food. That if people have access to nutritious food, that helps just the quality of life overall. And Chris, I'll hand it over to you. Do you want to talk a little bit about just the food pantries and the inconsistency of vegetables and fruits that you see in HACAP and in the food reservoir?
Yeah, everything that Emily said, I completely agree with, and is very true. Calories definitely are not a problem. Very early on, when I started working at HACAP, we saw a lot of food donations come in, but not necessarily always the most healthiest food options come in. The nutrient-rich food options that come in, it's very easy for companies to donate in bulk processed items, and we do like those items. Those items we can use to make a meal in some way, but you can't give all of those items out to a family at a food pantry because that just doesn't make a nutritious meal. If that's what we're really trying to do, which it is. So one of the key things that we've tried to do over the summertime is to work with the master gardeners of Linn County. We've really encouraged people to donate any extra produce that they've been growing in their gardens. Luckily, this past year we had a lot of people who had a bountiful harvest, and that doesn't always happen, but we say, hey, if that's you, please think about your food banks and your local food pantries and your local churches and anywhere that the food pantries that accept food donations in the area, because those things are really key into providing those nutritious foods to people who maybe don't have access to those foods. And then the other thing that goes with that too is from a cost standpoint too. If there is a family who can't afford to buy all healthy food or nutritious options at a grocery store, or introduced to some of those new foods, finding that food at a food pantry gives them an option to really get that food for free, and know that they can make a meal out of it or use it however they would like.
Great insights, Chris. And I like what Emily said about the equity of all people kind of being based on food access and nutrient access and all of that. You got me thinking about how I've heard that certain foods, like fast foods and such, are subsidized in one way or another. And I guess that kind of leads me into another question, or it might be tied to it. How is it that a state like Iowa that produces a lot of food, depending on what you're calling food there, how is it that we have people in our community who are either facing calorie deficiencies or more likely nutrient deficiencies? How does that come about in a state that produces so much food?
Yeah, this is really part of our conventional agricultural system that we've created over the decades. And to be forefront, there is merit to conventional ag, corn and soybeans. Right now, over 50% of the corn produced in Iowa goes to ethanol, and corn goes into clothing and plastics and so many of the things we use on a day-to-day basis. But to put it into perspective, Iowa has about 23 million acres of corn and soybeans, and we have an estimated 7,000 to 8,000 acres of vegetable production. And so in the early 1900s, Iowa had over 100 staple crops, and now we're down to 2. And if you add in cows and pigs, 4. And so we've really seen that diversity just be eliminated over the last 100 years. And with that, we are now growing products. When you drive across the state of Iowa, you think, wow, this is a lot of food. But in reality, the majority of the crops that are in our fields are not edible without being highly processed. And so one thing that we're really working with at Feed Iowa First is we grow vegetables for families and pantries and local health clinics. Our goal is to ensure that there's continuity and consistency in vegetables every week. So just like Chris was saying, sometimes they'll get in a shipment of, maybe a truck rolled over and HACAP gets 5,000 pounds of carrots. Our goal is to ensure that every one of our stops over the course of the growing season has just consistency that those families can rely on. The other thing that we are really working on right now is through our Equitable Land Access Program. We call it the ELA program, where we take especially underserved farmers. Maybe these are farmers who farmed in other countries that have now set up homes and lives here in Iowa, and be able to reestablish them on the land. We are really working with younger farmers and emerging farmers to start growing more local fruits and vegetables here in Linn County. And that's a long process. It's very difficult to get access to land. Land is incredibly expensive around Linn County right now. That we believe as we do so, and we set up both land and infrastructure, we'll be able to increase food security by growing here at home.
Yeah, I was going to say, if we really had the answer to that question, then we'd probably be good. But it's a very complex, thing, and that's why it's great to have organizations like Feed Iowa First, who are working to help do that in our communities. It's kind of just, it is kind of weird because Iowa is always known as being the breadbasket of the world, or whatever you want to call it. And yet, we have a hard time sometimes feeding individuals in our own community. And I think, going along with what Emily said, a lot of that's really great. And I think to piggyback off of that, 90% of it is about relationships. And she talked about making relationships even with the younger farmers. We've even seen in the whole ag scene about that's kind of a crisis, is getting younger individuals involved so that we have that future set up here in Iowa. And that's just such a big part of our DNA and what we do in this state. But also a big part of our DNA and what we do here is helping others. And and whenever there's a time of need, you always see Midwesterners doing what they need to do to help their neighbor. And so this kind of goes along with it. I mean, we really want to help our neighbors wherever they're at to get access to healthy and nutritious food items. So creating those relationships any way we can is a great start. It's a long process, but it's entirely worth it.
Creating those relationships and getting people incentivized to farm in that way. Yeah. Are there incentive programs or anything that are kind of encouraging young people to get into farming? I'm sorry if you maybe spoke a little bit to this already, Emily, but what are the incentives for people to start growing nutrient dense food as opposed to kind of the conventional crops and such? Do we know?
Yeah, Colton, that's a great question. First and foremost, we definitely have a gap. And so when we look at Cedar Rapids specifically, Cedar Rapids School District does not have FFA I believe Metro High School is the first high school that will be offering the first agricultural class. And so we're expecting kids who are coming out of our local school district to go into farming when they have had very little access or, ability to learn about that. And so I think that's one thing. Another thing is just being able to look at this differently. So a lot of times, those of us who have come out of conventional farms, we know the cost of farming, and it's incredibly high overheads and sometimes very little income coming back to the family. And so we're used to, very low prices in the typical commodities and equipment that's running into the tens of thousands, if not the hundreds of thousands of dollars now. And so when we look at local ag, especially what we call specialty crops, those are essentially fruits and vegetables. A lot of times, instead of having 100 acres or 5,000 acres to be very viable, sometimes you only need, 6 to 10 acres. And so I think a lot of it is just that education of the younger. As far as incentives, there's not a lot of incentives. A lot of our security nets for farming, they are structured for our conventional farmers. That is beginning to change. But one thing I'm really excited about, that HACAP is providing or participating in the LFPA program this year. The state of Iowa has set aside $1.7 million over the next, I believe it's 2 years, to buy from local farmers, specifically for food pantries and food reservoirs. And so I know in Cedar Rapids, that will be huge, both for farmers to be able to get in and have a safety net through the LFPA program, but also for HACAP to be able to get more fresh fruits and vegetables into their pantries that aren't necessarily, end of life at the grocery store, that have been sitting around already and no one wanted. And so these are products that'll be coming straight from the field into HACAP's pantry.
Excellent. Chris, anything on that?
Yeah, that's one of the big tasks that our volunteers do on a daily basis, is going through produce and making sure that the produce is good to send out. And we get a lot of stuff back, and our goal is to really not waste a lot of things. We don't want things to go to waste. And it always boggles my mind how much produce and fresh things come back from a grocery store that are still salvageable and still able to use. And so we want to get that out as quickly as we can to food pantries, various areas, so that they can be used by families. That's a big thing too. Also going with the FFA and 4-H groups. Those are always the best groups to see come in. I know we had a group at North Linn who continuously volunteer, but then they also raise chickens, and they have farm fresh eggs, that they have eggs that are fresh that they donate to us on a regular basis. So, then the kids get to come out and they see kind of from a start to finish process of, where this could go. And obviously one of those options is a food bank. So it kind of just really connects the dots when you see those students come out with those eggs. They get to see in action just where that those eggs can go to people in need, which that right there is really inspiring to see, and a great way of kind of empowering the next generation of farmers and people who are wanting to get into agriculture.
Yeah, that's a great. Going again back to something Emily said, she was talking about having maybe 5 or 6 acres to produce a viable amount of food for small time nutrient farmers, let's say, to produce. I just want to comment, anybody that's experienced having a garden that is maybe on a portion of an acre lot, I mean, you end up seeing more tomatoes than you can handle and more potatoes and everything, almost everything that you plant. Someone I know had a trellis with beans, and they had more beans than they knew what to do with. So it does seem true that you can have a small amount of area to work with and you can still produce a lot. Turning a little bit here, why should people who don't experience food insecurity, or at least think that they don't experience food insecurity issues, why should those people be concerned with the problem of food insecurity for those who maybe struggle with it the most, maybe besides the obvious point of being an ethical issue, but.
Yeah, that's a great question. One, I think just it's that sense of community, right? And going back to what Chris said, is here in Iowa, we band together, and through feed, we're able to grow anywhere from 30 to 40,000 pounds of fresh produce on about a quarter and an acre and a quarter in town, and then about an acre of potatoes outside of town. But we also take in about 25,000 pounds from local gardeners too. And, I think for us, especially, it's that relationship. And so what we see across is there's a lot of dynamics in our community right now, but in the garden and in the field, as we have volunteers come in and clients come in, it's just a place of gathering and a place of community. The other thing I would like to touch on is really a health perspective. Right now in Linn County, and this lines up with the United States, 1/3 of adults are pre-diabetic. That means that in the next 5 years, they have a high chance of developing the disease. And what we know from that, from statistics and data right now, is that we can decrease the chance of type 2 diabetes by 50 to 70% through very simple means. And one of those means is nutrition, is just providing fruits and vegetables to our most vulnerable populations and to our aging populations. And I think when we look at the health of the community as a whole, understanding food insecurity and understanding that food insecurity does not only affect the homeless and, the economically disadvantaged. Food insecurity right now affects, it's sprawling out into our middle class, and understanding the ramifications of that, especially through just long-term health and just the health of the community in general.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think one of the biggest things is to answer the question is that not a lot of people realize just how big of an issue it is here in Eastern Iowa. And for people who've maybe never experienced food insecurity before, it's pretty easy to kind of go about your daily life. And maybe they understand that there is, an issue, that there are food pantries in the community. But a lot of times our volunteers who come in, they understand that there's an issue. They want to do something about it. And then when they come through our doors and kind of see the impact that they're making, that's when they really realize just how great of an issue it is in our community. So I think the biggest thing is a lot of people may just not realize how great of an issue it is. And, pre-COVID, we were distributing around 14 million pounds of food out into the community. And I've had the chance to get to go on a lot of our mobile food pantries and hand out food, and the families that you see that come back, it just, it really kind of goes to show just, how widespread it is, like Emily was saying, and it's becoming even more widespread, and our numbers, they'll kind of reflect that. We're seeing newer families out to pantries, more of those kind of middle-class families, like what Emily was saying. So it really is, again, like I said, a bigger issue than what people might think.
Yeah, things are dynamic, and the issue is becoming larger. With the changing economy, I mean, we're experiencing heightened inflation at the moment. I'm sure that all of these play into the problem. And I heard someone say that you've kind of got a fixed budget and a fixed amount that you can expect every month to pay for, let's say, for example, your rent, and maybe you can predict the amount of money you're going to spend on gas. And maybe generally people have an outline for food, but I've heard that food is kind of the one that you can flex a little bit on. I mean, you have to get to work, whether that's by car or bike or whatever. You have to pay your rent, otherwise you'll become evicted. So is it true that people might kind of fudge their budget a little bit by maybe cutting back on nutritious foods, or that, and how do we see the changing economy and inflation and all of that? I mean, it sounds like it's all kind of tied together and affecting everybody, like you said, more and more.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I think it's just as simple as families are going to the grocery store and they have to make that decision to buy a box of, macaroni and cheese, or a box of fruit and vegetables, and, lean meats, and things that are more nutritious. Our food in general in the United States is about the third of the cost that it should be. And I think that's a really interesting perspective. Our food right now is incredibly undervalued, but we also see that on the end of what we're eating. And so that's a difficult decision for families to make. And I think it's even more difficult as we see new families come into the pantries. As Chris mentioned, we're seeing a lot of families who have never used food pantries or food assistance before. And a lot of them, it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing that they're not able to provide for their homes and for their families. And so our goal is to be able to provide food and services with dignity, to help people understand that this is a growing problem and that they may be able to do their best, but in our current climate and economy, sometimes that's not enough, and that's okay. And so we want to ensure that we're also providing food in a way that is welcoming and that makes people feel like they're welcomed here, and that they don't have to be ashamed to come and use these services.
I think dignity is a huge thing. With a lot more new families coming out, even after COVID, we saw, just a lot of families in crisis who needed food, and maybe who have never accessed a food pantry before. We did some mobile food pantries out at Veterans Memorial Stadium, and just a lot of comments from families who maybe felt ashamed that they didn't, never needed food, and now they did. And that still has kind of lingered on just due to inflation and so many other things. But, one of the biggest things is we have food to give. And if you're in need of food, don't feel ashamed, and we don't want to make you feel ashamed. That's the big thing too. Part of getting the food out is having people also feel comfortable to reach out to these organizations and feel like they can access that food. There's so many great food pantries in the area. We don't want to shame people into feeling like they can't get food. That's the absolute last thing that we want to do. So, there's absolutely no shame in that.
Yeah, we all are a community, and we do want to respect each other's dignity and not shame anyone. So we've only got about a minute and a half left here. What can we look towards for possible solutions, just real briefly, and what can the average person in our community do to try and help with the issue of food insecurity in Cedar Rapids or in Iowa at large? Just quick closing statements there.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that we're really working on at Feed Iowa First now is food access, and that's a lot larger circle. And especially through our immigrant and refugee communities, ensuring that we are growing food and have food accessible that you can't buy at our local grocery stores, because Iowans typically don't eat it. Our palates are not attuned to it. And by doing so, that's just an educational component too, that by ensuring that these foods are available to families who are settling here, we're able to sustain vegetable-based diets and hopefully help with that health equity piece.
Yeah, donating and volunteering is always a great way for people to get involved. We have a high buying power with the donations. We can buy a lot more food in a bulk rate with donations for a little cost. So it goes a long ways. And volunteering, it goes back to kind of what we were talking about earlier, and that's you really get to experience the issue at hand. You get to see what's going on in your community, which is a very important thing.
Great. Well, get involved, donate from your garden, whatever you can do. Thank you guys so much for talking about this with us tonight.
Thank you, Colton.
Yep. Thank you.